So you have a panel debate for the next 40 minutes or so, and it's with Torben. Sorry, missed your last name. Torben Ankjærø from Havsamarbejdet in Havsamarbejdet Østjylland, which is a collaboration across 7 municipalities who are focused on pretty much everything underwater, as I understood. And then with Jordan, Ole, and Thomas, who we have listened to throughout the day. And basically, we have a open discussion, so I'll lead it. And if you have any questions throughout, please raise your hand, and we will try and incorporate it as best as possible. Yes. So you will be sharing a microphone, and just pass it around you as you want. But I think to start with, so both Jordan and Thomas, in your presentations, you talked about standardization, right, and the need for that. But so maybe we can start with talking about why is it necessary and what is the benefits of standardization, and what should it encompass? Like, is it for biodiversity, or is it in general whatever you do underwater, and like how would you approach it if you had to put out a plan, or like maybe plans for how to standardize it? This open floor.
Would you like to start?
Okay. I think I would be keen on learning by what we know by language models right now. We do not know how to test them. There are plenty of data sets, plenty of tests out there, but they're not particularly good. And that means whenever a new data set comes out with a new set of metrics, then all method goes in that direction and optimize towards that. And then we see something else, and then we optimize towards that. So we don't really know how to test if it hallucinates or not in a good way, just to give an example. So I think I would be inspired by that, to do something different, that we need to look at both from a technical point of view. How can we actually assess these different things? What would be the golden standard data set to do so? But at the same time, understand what is it that the end users are interested in using this technology for? Because it has to be a little bit of both. Sometimes we hear, for example, there was somebody talking about the EIVA about explainability. Yes, you can do explainability, and if that's the only goal you have, then probably performance would go down. We have seen that in other domains. So therefore, we had to have a shared conversation at the same time about what's realistic and what do we want. So I think it's very important that this is not only a technical and not only a political debate, but it's something we do, with different perspectives in mind. That would be my attitude towards this.
Well, from the perspectives of the municipalities, we are interested in standardization of data in terms of that we can measure, like in the same way, different projects, and then learn across perspective of those projects, so we can, from different kinds of different areas of Denmark, we can share the knowledge based on the same standards. And it could be, if we're talking biodiversity, I think it's important to think in functional groups of species. So not like rare species necessarily, but those species that are forming the groups of what is actually a sea in a balance. For example, are there too many crabs out there? They're going to get a lot of imbalance in the ecosystem. So we need to measure standards that can give us a clue of, is the sea in balance or unbalanced? So specific species that are key species to the functioning of the sea. Yeah.
So, Thomas, you mentioned a bit about that there are different interests involved with these standardizations, right? And one interest we don't have present today, right, is fisheries. Or John, you working with them, but again, there's conflicting interest in the sense that the fishermen doesn't necessarily want to be monitored. There's a bit of resistance towards that. So how do we ensure that everybody's interests are taken into account in such a standard, and that we have a healthy environment, a healthy ecosystem surrounding our underwater environments from all and taking with respect to all concerns, because we don't want to just outright ban fishery, right? That doesn't make sense either.
We don't want to cancel fisheries. We don't want to close it, and that's I think part of the problem with the public debate that we have ongoing in Denmark at the moment. It's quite polarized, where you get the NGOs on one side wanting to ban trawling, and then you get the fisheries organizations on the other side saying that we don't want monitoring. And that's where I think we actually need to look at the regulation framework and say, what does make sense in this, and how do we actually simplify things? How can we actually give some carrots back to the fishermen for collecting this data? How can we actually show the fishermen that this data source, this camera data, the EM data that we're getting is actually of benefit to them? Because there are uses for them. They can actually observe how their quotas are being fished up. If they have the possibility of adopting free gear choice, then they can actually observe where their quotas are, how much they have left, and actually adopt selective devices to improve their fishery, trying to avoid actively catching their unwanted species. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm also thinking like how, so it does answer my question, but I'm also thinking like how would you facilitate, or how could we facilitate actually establishing standards within this? Because again, it's a very interdisciplinary area with biologists, with fishermen, with AI, tech people. Like, is it making like a consortium, Danish consortium, who sits down and then hash out like these are the standards for how to monitor and how to do it, or is there like do you have thoughts on
so if you take, I suppose, the ICES, so the International Commission for Exploration of the Seas, they're the ones that kind of govern the stock assessment, at least in Northern Europe here. And there's certain standards that we need to follow for collecting these data. There's time series that have been collected since the 1960s. And we follow that standard routine with standard gears to make sure that this time series is, continuous. And if we we can see that as we introduce new technologies and can see that they can actually play a large role in changing the way we do our surveys, we can actually improve them and get more data in there. But we also need to go back and actually benchmark against the old technique or the existing technique to make sure that there's no differences in those trends that we see coming forward, because we've changed our monitoring program.
So the current standards, you're saying they're quite old, right? Are they actually limiting right now what is possible, or is it like, or do you find that you can still work within these standards and deploy modern technologies, or is it?
I don't think the modern technologies are at a TRL level of being implemented into these standard routines yet.
No.
So we're still at the project phase of seeing that it is applicable, and then trying to test the question at hand before adopting it into routine monitoring, at least in terms of fisheries.
Yeah. So your work, as you presented, is focused more maybe on the utilities underwater and that aspect of it. How could the data that you record and the observations you make potentially feed into actually this monitoring of the general underwater environment? Because as you mentioned, it's not necessarily your data, but you could maybe potentially still do some observations on it pending allowance from your customers.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question, and I think it also relates into you, because it's probably for me, that's how do we make the industry, not the AI or technology, but the end users, how do we make them share the data? So for example, in Denmark, we have energy sectors. We have Ørsted, Vattenfall, we have Energinet, we have Total. They do a lot of these inspections. They collect a lot of data, and I'm sure they could be of interest in a lot of these cases, because they are places where there are species. That's just not their concern. So, but they keep the data themselves. So I think it's perhaps making some kind of community where it's okay to share the data. I think Norway is doing better because there's a closer cooperation between, for example, Equinor and some of the marine biology there. And also when they're talking about subsea mining, it seems to be that it's environment first and then the industry second. I think there's a mindset that goes around this, but I think in Denmark, we're not good at cooperating outside our own boxes. Because you can say the data is the value, but they're only using a fraction of the data. So I think it's been very popular to talk about big data. There's a lot of information that is not made available, even though it could be.
Can I?
Yeah.
On that note, a lot of the data, maybe the companies they do not want to share the images, but could one solution be to actually have some AI analyze the images and the results, for example, fish, the numbers, the species? Could that be a solution that you don't share the images themselves?
I think that's a good point. I don't know I'm not sure there's any regulations in Denmark, but for example, in Norway, everything within the, is it 50 miles or something on Norway, you're not allowed to share as raw data out, but interpreted, yeah, why not? So perhaps having where you can say, well, I have a model, can we run that on your premises? That why not? And basically, I don't know if you go to some Total in Esbjerg, who's got thousands of square meters of historical data. I guess they're just laying there for, no reason. And there would be a lot of value historical in that, I guess.
I think your point about making having this perspective of the industry as well, and how they can be included is quite important. And I know you, Torben, sorry, you mentioned that you are looking for partners and actually trying to collaborate across sectors, but also that there is a monetary constraint. So how can we make this ecosystem where sharing data and doing so without necessarily paying or being constrained by monetary means is feasible? What kind of data? How could you imagine doing that? And get this large scale observations of the Danish waters?
Yeah, I think and sort of a national database would be suitable for this to collect the data, and Havnaturfonden would be a funding where it would be maybe possible to actually collect those data. They're planning on doing it for the offshore wind power sector, but I think it should be more broad than that because there's so many investigations going on and so much data. But it might not also be important to have regulations about this. So certain type of data, especially if it's something that is governmental or some sort of public data, then put it in the database. So it's obligatory to do. And maybe the raw data could be some sort of a background, and because it's always dangerous to interpret on raw data if you're not suited for it. And also think to get this fully out, we need to have a project funded with specific scientific based standards that we actually form in a cooperation between scientists and the practitioners. So I think that's important, and we're looking for partners as well. Yeah.
Thanks. I think the idea of citizen science, as we have seen in other domains, can also play a role here. And I think I was thinking about when I heard your presentation that if, I'm not talking about you specific, but if it becomes easy for the public to assist, I think the public would help, especially on an agenda like this. I think it's important. And I know we were part of this, what was it called, sunfish, something, because they're very hard to get images of, but divers love to take pictures of these. So there was some organization where the divers could voluntarily, of course, upload the data. And I think they love to help because it was for AI for good, you know. So I think this, so it still has to be, money is still involved somehow, you know, to host the data and put the algorithms on top. But I think, generally speaking, on these agendas here, citizen science can actually play an important part.
And it has also been proven to be like very successful with terrestrial cases. So with iNaturalist and GBIF also have this database, right? So doing something that works subsurface also would be really cool. And I think I would also like to ask basically everybody, like, if you could look 10 years into the future, like what would your ideal scenario be with regards to our state of monitoring underwater environments? Like where would you hope to be in 10 years if everything goes perfectly? Maybe we can just go down the line.
I mean, then we would basically have these autonomous underwater vehicles, as EIVA was talking about, being cheap, reliable, and just being out there and figuring out themselves, you know, in some kind of self-organizing network, where to go and stuff like that, and then harvest all the data. And then on top of that, you would have all the models. And then hopefully these models would feed up to a decision level. So it will actually be used for something good. Could also be used for pure business, but for something good. That would be my kind of vision.
Agreed. And if there are any bright minds in the room today, and I hope there are, if anyone could invent a very efficient data communication underwater, wireless, that would be a breakthrough, because today you can have drones collecting the data. You need to offload the data and you need battery. So if we look at the industry today, they're talking about resident vehicles. They're placed close to the critical infrastructure. But that would mean you'll have a lot, and you could have power, of course. You can offload the data. But having those that can go in and monitor all over, that would be difficult. And I think there's some technology, battery and communication. And because, well, we all love the cloud, but you need to have something that can offload the data. And I don't have the solution, unfortunately. That would be amazing.
I can agree.
Jordan, about the fishing. Large vessels with the host.
So the nice, I think, moonshot, as the question we were given was, at least for fisheries, would be to say that the oceanographic data that we can collect from vessels out to sea and the catch data can actually feed into predicting where the vessels should be fishing to give you the sought after catch composition that you have available. The vessel goes out and fishes there. There's live feed coming up, so there's real-time data on the catch. You can actually, we're having some projects, I didn't mention it earlier, on developing active selective devices. So devices that can potentially, for example, sort out virgin, it's dolphins, is it correctly?
Yes.
So where you're actually in the gear where you can open it because you've already observed the dolphin coming in, and then close it again and continue fishing. Then you bring that up to the vessel. On the vessel, instead of having a line of 4 or 5 fishermen standing and sorting the different species and that, and then leaving the fish sit for half an hour while they eat lunch and this kind of stuff, it's automatically sorted. There's robots that are actually selecting the fish out, putting them in the right baskets to send it down into the hull on the ice. So that would be the perfect the moonshot for fisheries. I don't think we're talking 10 years though. I think it's 12 maybe.
12?
No, okay. I think we're 2050. So we're a long way out, but it's that's what would be nice if we could get there in the future.
Should I continue?
Yeah.
I think in 10 years, I hope we have systems that we can scale as well economically according to the project size, because we need to, when we have this project where we want to add the more biodiversity in the ocean, we need to use the money as best as we can and not half of them in the monitoring program. So maybe 15 or 10% of the money, the budget in the monitoring, and then the rest for the biodiversity. So the scaling of the monitoring is very important. That we still, if it's a small project, maybe we can use citizen science in a standardized way. And the bigger project we can add on with more detailed models. I think also it's important that when we look at the projects, we have another thing that is the general monitoring of the sea, which is specific stations now, very few of them in Denmark. So if we can broaden the network of sensors, and then we can use, maybe get more information in that way and use AI, so we can have a more detailed look at how the environment is changing. For example, we can see oxygen depletion in very low areas, sometimes 2 meters of depth in some of the fjords, and that data was not collected by the Nirvana program in Denmark. It was actually some scientists who discovered that you have problems in even the low waters. So we need, hopefully in 10 years, we have a broader network of data collection, and then we have more knowledge so we can act better. Also with fishing, also with dredging for sand, for example, the effects of all those different activities that is more detailed described, so we can better act on how to protect nature.
Yeah, so something like this continuous monitoring that Thomas also touched upon in his talk, and basically have a live view of the state of our marine situation in Denmark. Right.
Yeah, it's and the effect monitoring that is going to be more continuous and better, because then we can act easily on how to protect the areas. Yeah.
Then I have a follow-up question. How far are we from in respect of doing that? Like, how dense is our current monitoring, and like how like what are the immediate problems that you're facing right now? For example, for your vision here, like what is the first hurdle like that needs to be broken before you get try and realize it?
I think there are two things. The first is the price of the monitoring. It's high at the moment, also because we're in a phase of development. So we need funding usually to get those the right data. And the next thing is the standardization, so that we have a system we can actually be sure that this is scientifically valuable, the data we get. So we need to develop more on the models, and then the price. We need the scaling of the price, according to the project.
We also extend the question to the three of the others, and also extend it to. So, John, if you have a response.
Just regarding the cost, because we have fishing vessels that are fishing in large parts of Danish waters and sending fishing gear up and down multiple times a day, sitting out there for multiple days fishing. And so in theory, we actually have a very nice data platform, not only give us the environmental variables at the surface, but also down at the seabed. So looking at the hypoxic regions and these kind of things, then you can actually start to get a much more detailed picture potentially of how large these hypoxic areas are and what is their change in distribution and these kind of things. So all of a sudden you've got quite a good data platform that you could potentially make very good use of and increase your resolution.
Yeah, and directly feed that to the relevant scientists who can then analyze
correct
and interpret it.
Yeah.
One thing I'm also interested in is, so, as Thomas mentioned, AI is everywhere right now, and it's something that touches everybody's life, maybe often also in invisible manners. But how far are we from taking that AI and then just putting it into the ocean, right, into the marine space, and then is that feasible, or how much development and modifications are needed before we can actually use the advances from the last 10-15 years, and also within robotics and just in technology in general, how do we handle this harsh environment?
Do I start? I
Yeah.
can start.
Yeah.
I suppose if we take the underwater camera development that I presented earlier, where we've started training the models, we've got relatively good species recognition on them. We've started developing the front end. We can get the data up. It's still an expensive system, so it still costs around 100,000 euro. If you look at the cost of the camera, that's probably around a third of that. So there's 2/3 in relation to getting the information up to the wheelhouse. So the next challenge is to try and put that onto an edge device and have that computed at the seabed and pass this information up acoustically. That's until you develop your new system to get us the data through the water. So if doing that gets us a much cheaper system. We're still lacking a business case. So we don't have the documentation to say what real life effect does this have for the fishermen that are out there. How can this value optimize their fishery? If you look at the political debate in Denmark at the moment, it's very polarized. So there's a lot of NGOs that are saying banning trawling. So that doesn't make it very attractive for a fisherman to go and spend 100,000 euros on an investment that he might not be able to use tomorrow. So that also makes it hard for buy-in from them as well. So if we can get a business case, we can reduce the buy-in cost. I think we can get quite far relatively quickly, at least with that.
Yeah, so if there can be provided documentation of the effect of this monetization and see if that can be like this sweet point of having trawling but still maintaining a good underwater ecosystem, then that would be a goal, so to say.
Yeah.
I think for trawling, it's a matter of having reduction of the total area of bottom that is affected by trawling. You can still have some, but we need to prioritize where we are allowing these area. Then we can still have some monitoring there, I think. And also the sandy bottom is not as it's more tough than the muddy bottom, for example. So you can prioritize where to do the activities and then get some data as well. That could be interesting also for oxygen depletion. Yeah.
Just one comment. We always talk about trawling being trawling, and trawling is not just trawling. There's the Moeslund trawling, which I presented earlier, but there's also a lot of trawling that takes place on shallow sandy bottoms, where an autumn storm in the autumn has much more of a shift in the sediments. And then there's also pelagic trawling as well, so which actually takes place in the water column. So therefore, the seabed impact is basically zero. So we need to keep that nuance as well. Is trawling's not just trawling, so we shouldn't ban trawling. We should maybe look at specific types of trawling.
Discussion.
Yeah.
Ole and Thomas, where do you think what is needed to transfer the current technologies we have from terrestrial into subsurface monitoring?
Well, personally, I think we are getting quite close. If I look just 5 years ago, we didn't see AI at competitors or partners. Only a very few of them mentioned it. Some of them popped up and got broke quite soon because they were too soon. Today, if we go out on a conference, everybody talks about it, and a lot have already implemented bits and pieces for it, and especially talking about doing real autonomous underwater vehicles. You need it. You can't do without it, because otherwise you always need a man in the loop. You need comms, and so that's the thing. And back in March, I was in a conference in Norway where a guy from an energy company asked, I don't know why, but he asked, "Do we trust in AI?" I think we have to turn around now and say, "Do we trust in humans?" Because I think that's where we are. It is happening, and it's going fast. And especially in our branch, well, if we're not on that train, then we'll be out of work, because it is the only thing that can help us.
I think from an AI point of view, what is lacking is that what you heard today is also people saying, so we made it work here, and then we went there, and it didn't work at all. But then we just retrained, and then it worked. It would be nice to understand why did it work here when it worked here. So we still need to understand a bit more about how is it actually these AI algorithms are working? Because when we figure that out, then we might not have to retrain when we then go to Jamaica or whatever the example was. We can simply change some parameters in the model. So I think but that's a technical. I mean, we can solve that with more data, but I don't like that approach. I would like to understand why.
I totally get that, but I think there's also a part of it that's like the fundamental question of when does it work? Like, what is necessary? Like, when is it good enough for the end users to help with their use case? And how do you find that point? Like, is it being able to recognize each individual species in the Danish waters, or is there like a middle ground where you don't necessarily have 100% accuracy all the time, because then we won't be done in 100 years?
No, and that was my point with this, that we have to come together, because if I put my science hat on, I just want to recognize a specific species as good as possible. But it might be that's irrelevant for the Danish context. You just need statistics about how many animals, your activity, or what have you. So this is exactly my point, that we need, and to be able to understand that, and because the argument can also be turned around, that the decision makers, they might like this and this and that, but they need to know what's hard and what's not hard, because so then they can say, okay, but then these three are fine for now, and then let's do that, and let's wait with the other things.
So I want to hear if there's any questions from the audience that you want to ask any of our panel members. Yeah.
My question is for Thomas. You mentioned at the end of your talk you should like come together and develop a foundation model.
Yes.
I was wondering if you had more concrete ideas as to how technically this looked like. Because in language models, a foundation model is basically a model that you train to fill holes in the text. But I've heard a lot of very different applications of AI. And I was just wondering if you had this.
No, a foundation model is a general model within a specific field that kind of understand the underlying structures of what we're looking for. That could be images, sound, point clouds, that doesn't matter, text for that. So it's just this idea of having a general model. That's what I mean by a foundation model. And they tend to be very big, and therefore they have a number of parameters, high number of parameters, and therefore we need a lot of data. So my point is, if we are going to build this, then we need access to all the data people are hiding from themselves, because they spend a year, blah, 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 blah. And this is exactly the same thing we see in the community around the Danish language models. That's the same thing. So we need to have access, then they also have the copyright, blah, blah, blah. But we need to have access to all that data if we want to build a Danish foundation model for language. So it's kind of the same thing I'm arguing here. I don't necessarily, it's just, I think it could actually be nice. And I think it also could feed into, if we actually move now and we combine this with the ideas for metric standards, we could kind of be first movers. It cannot only be bottom up, but I don't think it can only be top down. It has to be somewhere in between. Then we could perhaps have some business advantages also going forward. So that's what I kind of mean with these two things, standardization and foundation model. So basically, let's come together.
Another question, which is addressed all three, because business case was mentioned a couple of times today. Some of these business cases we mentioned had to do with compliance, and we were wondering how realistic this business case is, given that Europe right now is in advanced to basically figuring competition over sustainability compliance. Is there other legislations that need help compliant-based business model in the case of underwater? Because I'm thinking, for example, about the corporate sustainability directive. 80% of companies in Europe no longer have to report on their impact on the environment. And that might hit the business case.
I'm not sure it will necessarily end like what you're saying now in the EU. I understand due to the geopolitical blah, 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 that innovation is in the high seat, but there is also other voices saying that, well, perhaps the only way to innovate is actually doing it right. That means that we might not have an advantage right now, but what we actually saw with the GDPR was in the beginning, it was also crazy and yada, yada, yada. But then some of the other, or most of the other countries outside the Eurozone, they started to adapt the GDPR in order to be able to sell within the European market. So we might actually see the same here. So I'm just saying, they didn't answer your question. It's just saying, I don't necessarily think we in the Eurozone is going to just say, now it's just innovation. We do the Musk way, we just break things and move on. I'm not sure it would be like that, but that's a personal opinion.
Well, it's quite interesting you asked that, because over the last year, we've been in the process of doing this evaluation of the sustainability. And when it then was saying, okay, we might not have the same requirements, we discussed whether we should put it on hold, but we decided that we still think it's a commercial stamp to have it, even though it's not a requirement, because we think that it would be popping back, and because we produce equipment that might end up in, or at least being used at the sea. So it's very important that we can track these things. So I think that even though it's I don't know how many clauses it is we have to read and try to understand, it's difficult, but I think there is a meaning behind it. And I think most companies that we are aware of, they do want to follow it, even though it's not as hard requirement now. So hopefully.
Specifically with what I was referring to with the business case in terms of intro cameras, is not the business case of the technology producer, but the business case for the fisheries. So at the moment we have a data poor scenario where they can't actually make decisions based on their ongoing activities. And how do we show to the end user that there's a better business case when this technology is adopted? That makes it clearer.
Well, I think according to if we want to have more companies engaged in this, at the moment it's the larger companies that are actually moving forward, as I can see it. Also the ones that we are collaborating with, that actually are doing some biodiversity projects in the ocean. So I think the following years, we might see smaller companies also adding smaller values to bigger projects, but like projects that are made with parts from many different companies to all together to make partnership projects, because it's difficult for the smaller companies to raise big projects, and I can see that in the moment they're not doing it that much for the ESG, but more because it's nice for the company to have this story, and also to tell and recruit new employees actually to tell that we are actually doing something to make a difference out there, not just to pollute, for example. So I think there's different angles to it than the ESG. Yeah, and I believe that if we're good at selling those projects in the ocean, the companies will also start to invest in marine biodiversity and not only on land. That's our goal. Yeah.
Sorry? Yeah, final question. We have time for one. Yeah. Do you have a hand? Or sorry, I don't know your name. Yeah.
So exactly, we want to aim to restore biodiversity, we want to minimize pollution, but how do we then ensure that all this technology that we bring into the ocean is adding?
Well, the monitoring part of it, well, I cannot see that it's going to be a big problem with pollution. Of course, if you have big vessels that are making some monitoring, then you can have some added pollution. But the stationary monitorings, I don't think they have some particular pollution. But maybe you can add.
The camera, of course, mounting a camera on a trawl, and if you get snagged on a wreck or or on a rock or something and you lose your fishing gear, that can lead to some form of environmental pollution. Fisheries have been using sensors mounted on their gears for the last probably 20 years to measure the spread between the doors and the height of the gear, and putting very basic catch sensors on the trawls. So from past experiences, if they do lose their gear, they're quickly back in harbour to get a specific hook, and they know exactly where they've lost their gear. So they typically spend quite a lot of effort to try and recoup their equipment. The sensor packages that some of these vessels have on their gears at the moment, it's in the vicinity of 1 million kroner. So I think they're quite quick to get their gear back, and this would also be an added cost to them, so they wouldn't want to lose their equipment.
No, but it's a very relevant point, because you can say some of the equipment we sell is towed behind a vehicle and operated very close to the seabed, and it do hit the ground and breaks. And then you can say if there's a small pit that fall off, they don't recover it. So it is having a certain impact. But then it's down to saying, what is it that you're losing? Because traditional battery has been a critical source, because you didn't want to have batteries laying there or things with oil in it. So I think there's a lot of more regulations around what you put down there, and also traceability on what's there. But the next is, of course, how much do you recover? But I still think fishing gears and lobster traps and things like that is a worse problem, because there's so many of them, but still it is very valid.
Okay, I can just last comment is that the FAO are doing a lot of work on documenting of fishing gears. So they've come out with guideline practices to follow of abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gears, and how to go about those. And one of the things that they've put down is that to use RFID tags as an example, is to make sure that when the gear is set, you know where it's been set. When it's been retrieved, you know when it's been retrieved. If there's a mismatch between those, then you know approximately where the gears are lost, so you can potentially recoup it quite quick. So that could be one way, but then again, it's using technology to mount on gears that end up getting lost. So there's also that aspect that needs to be considered as well.
You have something else to say?
Or just that it's also the disturbance that we might add to the environment, and also there are other types of movements than just losing the gear, but also underwater noise that AUVs generate, and other things that we need to take into account when we start adding all these methods into the ocean.
I think in the interest of time, we might have to take this discussion afterwards in the posted session, and get our poster boards in here. But yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much, Torben, Gordon.
So thank you for moderating this as well, Joakim, and really nice discussions. Now we'll have a poster session, and this actually concludes this workshop or one-day conference, or whatever you call it. Tools. I had a talk with him yesterday, and he said, like, this is not a workshop; it's a one-day conference you are doing. But when we decided on calling this a workshop, we expected 30 people, so, or maybe 20 or something. So I don't know what it is, but it's done more or less now. We have the poster session, and we'll not meet in here afterwards. It's just social, talk to each other, discuss, make new collaborations, eat some cake and have some coffee, and all the feedback you have, if you have mostly positive feedback, I would like to hear it. If there are negative feedback, also send me an email and I may reply. No, but I think this has been a really good day for me, at least, and hopefully it has inspired some of you and you have learned something, and I've heard positive things, and if I hear more, then hopefully I can convince someone that we can do this again, maybe next year. So I think it's really nice that so many people from so many different institutions, companies, startups, NGOs, etc., meet today in this and talk about such a interdisciplinary field as environmental monitoring is. And I think it's needed. We touched upon some of the problems here in the discussion, but there are so many more questions to be asked and answered, and in order to do anything that is standardized. So we need to do more than just having one meeting now. And I also think this could be a way to people from around the country actually meeting each other within different fields, but working, for example, as biology students or computer vision scientists, that could actually meet other people within the same field-ish and socialize. So I think hopefully we can do this again next year, but I probably have to convince AI Denmark or Pioneer Center or someone else to put some money in it again. And just seeing the number in here, I think that is quite convincing. So thank you all for being here. And now let's have a good time outside. We have like a poster session thingy here and also a bit of down by the stairs. So it's 2 areas with posters. So just mingle around and yeah, thank you for today.